Dermatomes. Dermatomes, by definition, are skin segments, so they're regions on the surface of the body that are innervated by neurons housed in specific spinal nerves. So the skin of the entire body is supplied by spinal nerves that carry somatic sensory nerve impulses into the spinal cord. There's only one area that is not innervated by spinal nerves, but instead a cranial nerve, and that is your face. Your face, the skin of your face, is innervated by a nerve called the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. Everywhere else is innervated by spinal nerves. And we've mapped these regions on the surface to the specific spinal nerves. We found that C1 actually does not innervate the skin, but all the other spinal nerves do. This gives us a lot of information to help us determine what spinal nerve or what area of the spinal cord might be malfunctioning or injured. So, for example, if we feel as if an individual has a spinal cord injury, maybe a car accident, we can assess their sensory, their ability to sense stimuli on the surface of the body, and we can determine based on the patterns of numbness where along that spinal cord the injury has occurred. For example, let's say we are assessing the patient and they can sense touch at this T11 dermatome. They can sense touch at T10 and all the other spinal nerves going from T11 all the way to T2. The problem occurs at T12, let's say. Let's say at T12, L1, and L2, and everything below that, they are not sensing that stimulus. That would indicate that there's an issue between 11 and 12. So maybe at that point in the spinal cord, the injury occurred and is not allowing sensory transmission up through that injured region. So that gives us a good idea where that injury is, and we can focus in on that area of the spinal cord. So these are dermatomes. Again, very clinically relevant, used by neurologists to assess possible nerve injury, but also spinal cord injury. Okay, let's talk about reflexes. Reflexes are rapid, involuntary motor responses to some sort of environmental or external stimulus. Or, in fact, it could be an internal stimulus. Reflexes help maintain homeostasis by permitting the body to make very, very fast adjustments. When we are characterizing reflexes, we often use a couple different parameters. One is what nerve is mediating the reflex. If it's a spinal nerve, we call it a spinal reflex. If it's a cranial nerve, we call it a cranial reflex. Some examples. If you step on a painful stimulus, that's a spinal nerve, because the foot is innervated by spinal nerves, obviously not cranial nerves. Touching a hot object, again, your hands are spinal. This is an interesting one in that stretching of a tendon is a spinal reflex. We'll talk more about that one. That's actually a really important one. Salivating is cranial, so that's a reflex. Doesn't really protect the body, but it's getting the digestive system ready for the food. Blinking. So if there's an object coming towards the eye, and that's the dangerous stimulus, blinking will protect that eye. Blinking is controlled by cranial nerves. Then we have in blue whether it's a somatic reflex or an autonomic reflex. Somatic reflexes involve the somatic nervous system, and therefore the response is a skeletal muscle response. If it is a cardiac muscle response, a heart change, if it's a smooth muscle response or a glandular response, we call that an autonomic reflex. So, for example, salivating. Production of saliva is done by a gland. So that is a cranial autonomic reflex. Blinking is a skeletal muscle response. So it's a cranial somatic reflex. Stepping on a tack is a spinal somatic reflex. So we often use these combinations to help characterize the reflex. Here's an example of a reflex arc. Painful stimulus, sensory transmission, motor output, effector being a skeletal muscle to remove that area of the body from this painful stimulus. So let's look at one that we're all familiar with. We probably all remember being tapped at our patellar ligament using this little mallet. And our leg jerked a little bit. What this reflex is an example of a stretch reflex. So what are stretch reflexes? Well, when muscles stretch too much, that could cause damage. So a stretch reflex is actually protecting a muscle from damage due to overstretching. Most of your muscles have this ability. So when you're walking, when you're moving, when you're exercising, your muscles are always conscious of overstretching. They do not want to overstretch. So as a result of initial stretching, that muscle, in order to prevent further stretching, contracts. And this happens involuntarily. You're not conscious of this. But whenever you're moving around, your body always knows if a muscle is stretched too much, and it will respond by contracting. Now, why do we do this in the clinic? Well, your doctor does this to assess your nervous system, because these responses are all based on nerve impulses. So let's take a look at the path of this, what we would call a patellar reflex, which is an example of a stretch reflex. The initial stimulus is using a mallet, or using this rubber mallet, which stretches the patellar ligament. Well, when you hit that patellar ligament, it tugs on the quadriceps femoris tendon, which tugs on the muscle. So it actually pulls that muscle a little bit. That muscle gets pulled and stretched and gets stimulated at what's called the muscle spindle. A muscle spindle is actually a stretch receptor. It detects stretching of that quadricep muscle. That triggers a nerve impulse. That nerve impulse goes into the spinal cord. It quickly innervates and synapses with a motor neuron that comes right back out to that same muscle, stimulates the muscle to contract. When your quadriceps femoris muscles contract, your knee extends and you get that classic little jerk. Now, when your quadricep muscle contracts, you have to relax the antagonistic muscle, your hamstring. So there's actually a reciprocal reflex, a reciprocal innervation. Same sensory stimulus comes in, but now we're also going to stimulate an interneuron, and the interneuron inhibits this motor neuron, which goes to your hamstring. So we're stimulating the quadricep, inhibiting in order to relax the hamstring. If we didn't do that, and your quadricep contracted, it would stretch the hamstring and possibly injure the hamstring. So there's actually two reflexes going on in this picture. The first one, the patellar reflex, is a monosynaptic ipsilateral reflex. What does that mean? There's only one synapse. There's only one connection between sensory and motor. And the response is on the same side of the body. It's an ipsilateral response. Using the terms on the previous slide, this would be a spinal somatic reflex. So now we got 4 terms that describe this reflex. Spinal, because it's spinal nerve. Somatic, because they're skeletal muscles. Monosynaptic, because there's just one synapse. And it's ipsilateral, because it happens on the same side of the body. The reciprocal response is a polysynaptic reflex because it requires this interneuron. This interneuron is extremely important to this reciprocal reflex because it is converting the impulses from stimulatory to inhibitory. So it can turn off this neuron and cause that hamstring to stay relaxed. So it's a pretty complicated little pathway, very useful to a doctor, because if a doctor taps this patellar ligament and this leg doesn't jerk, there might be a problem with these nerves. Maybe they're not myelinated properly. So individuals with, for example, multiple sclerosis have maybe suppressed reflexes due to improper myelination. We can also follow the myelination in a child by testing their reflexes, and reflexes should get quicker as a baby and as a child develops their myelination. So very useful for the assessment of the nervous system. Another example of a reflex, and again, there's 2 reflexes on this figure. There's a flexor withdrawal reflex, and there's a crossed extensor reflex. Both of these reflexes occur in response to some sort of dangerous, painful stimulus, for example, on your foot. So there's this painful stimulus that activates a pain neuron, a pain-sensitive neuron called nociceptors. That pain stimulus goes into the spinal cord. All kinds of synapsing occurs, but let's follow what happens on the same side. We stimulate a flexor muscle. That's a hamstring. A hamstring flexes that knee. Flexing the knee allows you to withdraw that leg from the painful stimulus. So you touch on something painful, you can withdraw that leg from the painful stimulus using this flexor withdrawal reflex. It's polysynaptic, it's ipsilateral, and it helps you respond to that dangerous stimulus. There's also a contralateral reflex. So now we can follow this same sensory path into the spinal cord, but look at what we're doing. We're crossing over to the other side of the body, so it's a contralateral response, and we are stimulating the extensor muscles. Those would be your quadriceps. So what does that do? That helps to balance. You have to be able to balance on the opposite leg if you're removing the right leg from the painful stimulus. In order to balance, you extend the knee on the left leg, and that allows you to balance. So it's a crossed extensor reflex. Polysynaptic, both of these are polysynaptic, but this one is a contralateral. It's an opposite side of the body. So a lot of reflexes that you are fairly unaware of, because this doesn't require, notice none of this requires a brain. You don't need a brain to do this. Now, you will tell the brain. There are nerve transmissions up to the brain. That just helps remind you that, you might want to pull that tack out of the toe, because if it stays there, it's going to keep hurting. It also maybe converts some of this to memory, so you learn that stepping on nails hurt. So there is information going to your brain, but these 2 reflexes actually don't require a brain. Pretty interesting. So that's the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and spinal reflexes.